Good morning, everyone. It is a Tuesday morning and it is July 22nd. I cannot believe we are at the end of July. That is kind of scary.
It's as cool as it is.
And it is as cool as this. Hasn't it been beautiful weather out there? I love that. All right. So today we are coming back once again to talk about the seller compensation addendum and related challenges. Those of you online, I've got several of you. If you want to join in the conversation, just unmute yourself. I can't see your face and I cannot necessarily see that there's anything on the chat just because the way the screen pops up here. If I see it, I will try to jump over to chat, but otherwise unmute yourself. That's fine. Let's see if it's going to take. There we go. So, we can't start with seller compensation addendum without talking just a smidge about the buyer broker compensation. So let's start with a few questions. How does the buyer broker get paid per the 2025 Arizona Association of Realtors contract document, or the purchase contract? Let's put it that way. So is it A, the buyer or the seller, B, both the buyer and the seller, C, the listing broker, or D, buyer, seller, and listing broker? Any responses, or maybe something that isn't there? Give me a response.
It could be A and B.
Yeah.
Okay, folks here are saying A and B. How about anybody online? You want to unmute and give me a response? Oh, you guys are going to be shy back there. Come on.
Yeah, the buyer can.
Okay.
The seller can.
Let's answer that. Yes, you're correct. Either A or B. What is really important, no longer does the listing broker pay the buyer broker at all. They need to make sure people understand that this has come up multiple times over the last 2 weeks. And we'll probably go into more detail with that later, but let's get to the seller compensation addendum. So, true or false? To counter the seller compensation addendum, the seller should draft a new seller compensation addendum.
False.
False. But why? The document says it can be created by either the buyer, the seller, the landlord, or the tenant. Why is that the case?
Because you need the, gosh, it's a long one. I know the form.
So
Addendum.
you use a counter offer to counter the SCA as you would counter anything on your purchase contract, right? So, but why does the seller compensation addendum actually say that the seller could check that box? For those of you that want to show your seller is willing to contribute a set amount, guess what? You can create the seller compensation addendum and show that they're going to pay blah, 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 and have it out there. Now, do I recommend that? No. But can you do that? Yes, you can do that, right? So it is possible, but I really don't recommend it. But it is there for that reason. So same thing if you are representing a landlord and the landlord wants to say they are paying X marbles to a tenant's agent, they can have that already prepared and in the listing. That is fine. The seller is offering that. I'm sorry, I don't think you can load it in there, but you can send it to the other agent if you wanted to. Okay, I think we've got one more question. Yep, we covered that. We got one more question here. True or false? Sellers should sign the SCA even if they are counting the buyer broker compensation amount on line 10. Anybody online? Come on, let's get somebody online to give an answer here. I got 5 of you online other than myself, of course. So somebody online unmute and tell me true or false. The seller should sign the SCA even if they are counting the buyer broker compensation amount on line 10.
True.
True. Look at that. Yes, indeed. This has been the #1 issue and question I keep getting. Well, the seller didn't sign the SCA. They said they didn't have to. So what I usually say to people is if the seller counters an HOA addendum and says that they're not going to pay the community preservation fee of $5,000, say for Sun City, do they still sign the HOA addendum? And every agent doesn't hesitate to answer that. Yes, they do. Guess what? The seller compensation addendum is just like any other addendum. It's a part of the contract, right? Okay, so let's see what we have next. Counteroffer 1. Here are some ways that I have seen. These are literally from your contracts, folks. These are ways people have countered the compensation. This is not necessarily I would recommend it. I'm just showing you what people have said. They have created a set fee, which then they're saying reflects 2.5%. Not sure what happens then if the price changes, which I don't know, things change. So you're kind of making it confusing. It should be either dollars or percentages. So then of course, buyer agent compensation to be 2.5%. And then how about this? Seller compensation addendum, which is what's being modified, right? Line 10 of the seller compensation addendum is what's being modified. And in this case, it's being modified to 2.5%. And you can write a full purchase price. By the way, that automatically stays because if you change just the 2.5, the rest of that sentence that it's modifying says full purchase price, right? I mean, it's right there. You don't actually have to write that out. But if you want to, that's fine. I recommend that third option as the way to counter this. Now, the upper two were agents that refused to have their client sign the SCA. So this is where you get into confusion here is all of a sudden they're not countering the SCA, but you have an SCA addendum that's attached that says one thing, and then you're countering verbiage that relates to the SCA, but it's not actually referencing the SCA. How many of you would counter the HOA addendum and not say, I'm countering line 200 or 120 on the HOA addendum, right? How many would counter the purchase contract and not reference this is the purchase contract line, da 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 da, or the solar addendum and not say I'm countering the solar addendum, right? So please reference that you are countering, and it is line 10, right? Seller compensation addendum line 10. That's pretty much the only line that you will modify.
I would really appreciate it.
Oh, and by the way, from our title folks here, title says they would really appreciate that you be that clear because then they know exactly what is being countered.
Can I interject?
Yes, absolutely.
So I had a transaction where the buyer presented the contract when SCA, the buyer signed it, the seller never signed it. I questioned it, agents never addressed it, then I got an addendum saying that the SCA commission would be X amount of dollars, and it had a percentage and a dollar amount, and they didn't calculate outright. So I went back to the agents, okay, what are we doing here? What am I giving the buyer's agent? 2 days later, I got an SCA for a different amount, signed only by the seller.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, and it was different than the addendum amount or the original buyer presented SCA. So no one would ever address it. So I kind of like, I guess when you guys want to get paid, you'll decide how you're going to let me know. So once I finally got the CDIs that were signed by the brokers, I went with that and said, okay, they're agreeing to accept this much. So I presented to the sellers in a settlement statement. Sellers said fine, and that was it. But it can get very trying for us.
So the SCA was never signed by both parties.
No, well, yeah, it was, but they're
not,
They're not the same one.
Two
They were
different.
different ones.
they were signed in counterpart with the
Right.
same amount.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why you don't draw another one.
Yes, you don't draw another one. That's an interesting scenario. So what also could happen is that you have the seller creating their own, right? But so this did happen, not in this office, in another office. Someone had their seller accept the purchase contract. They did not sign the SCA. And then after that, they sent a new SCA that the seller had signed and said, yeah, this is what we're going with. A little bit of a problem.
Yeah.
There was no counter and they accepted the contract, which includes the addendums. So now we have a problem because buyer and seller are not in agreement, but the seller signed. So please, folks, understand it is your job as the listing agent to present that offer with the seller compensation addendum and make sure that the seller understands A, they must sign, or B, they must counter it. They still sign, but they counter it. Do not accept a contract and then plan to make a change later, right? If I turn this back to the HOA addendum, if that HOA addendum, it says seller pays this community preservation fee, and I only pick on Sun City because it's such a large one, right? $5,000, right? If the seller signs that purchase contract with that HOA addendum and doesn't sign the HOA addendum, but it says seller's paying this, who's now paying that HOA addendum? I think most people in a court would be saying the seller is. So please understand as the listing agent, that's your job to make sure the seller understands what they're agreeing to. We'll get into this in a little more detail with a lot of other complications, but we're going to go through this. And the first thing for everybody to know is that on the purchase contract as a buyer broker, make sure that the seller compensation box on line 37 is checked. I'll explain why this is so important later, but please, please make sure you have that checked. Okay. So here I'm going to ask it again. Does the seller have to sign the seller compensation addendum if they countered it in the counteroffer?
Yes.
Let's get this through everybody's heads. Okay, I'm going to go over this line by line because a lot of people that don't want to include the seller compensation addendum seem to forget there is more than line 10 in here. So first of all, it begins very simply, seller, buyer, landlord, tenant. I know that some people are confused that that seller box is there, but as I said, they do have the right to preset a seller compensation addendum and share it with somebody that's interested in writing an offer. And by the way, if you are a buyer's agent and you are showing homes right now, you still probably need to pick up the phone and ask the listing agent if they have any offers. Kind of crazy that I've heard from several of our agents that they went under contract and then had somebody else call and be surprised that they went under contract over a weekend and we're going to submit an offer and it was already under contract. So don't forget, use your phones, right? Use your phones, call, text, right? So basic stuff, date, buyer, seller, landlord, tenant, the premises. The following additional terms and conditions are hereby included as part of the contract, right? Or the lease agreement can be used for either between seller and buyer. And again, if you are not aware that anytime you see buyer or seller, that also means tenant landlord per the contract, you can see it up above for the above reference premises. So this document is a part of that purchase contract. It's an addendum to the contract, okay? This addendum provides the undersigned's written consent for buyer broker to receive compensation for more than one party to the transaction. Why is that important? So no buyer or seller, no seller signs this addendum. The buyer broker doesn't care that they could potentially be paid by two people? More than one who would be those two entities? We talked about it earlier. The buyer and the seller, right? So if the buyer broker says 3 potatoes and the seller compensation addendum says 2.5 potatoes, did you not want to be paid by two people? You're only agreeing to be paid by one. If that counteroffer goes through and there's no seller compensation addendum, are you able to be paid by two people? Title, you probably wouldn't care, would you? Title wouldn't care, but probably not.
Tell me who to pay.
Tell me who to pay and if they agree to pay it. But do you understand there is a line there that actually says you as the buyer broker can be paid by two people?
Yeah.
You're the one filling these out. Do you not want this moved forward, right?
And you also have to have that conversation. In the beginning.
That's right. You have to have that conversation with your buyer broker. So seller and buyer explicitly intend brokers to be direct third-party beneficiaries of the contract and or lease agreement pursuant to this addendum and either section 8F or section 9G of the contract. The provisions of this addendum shall survive close of escrow. Why is it important to be a third-party beneficiary? What does that even mean? Does anybody know what third-party beneficiary means? We'll ask title in just a second if nobody answers the question. Anybody online? Everybody here is quiet. They're looking at me puzzled. You want to take this? What's a third-party beneficiary?
It's not buyer or seller, it's an outside entity receiving,
Correct.
the
And,
beneficiary is receiving.
and is the buyer broker a part of the contract?
No.
No. You're not a part of the contract. You're a third-party beneficiary. So again, if the seller compensation addendum actually isn't signed, are you able to receive payment from anybody?
Maybe not.
Technically, no, right? I think title's saying when they get their CDIs, they're allowing it to go through.
Right.
But understand that if this were to go to a court of law and there were an argument about this, if you don't have that seller compensation addendum, I would expect the court to have an issue with you being allowed to be paid anything at all. So how important is it to get the seller to sign that seller compensation addendum?
Very.
It beyond me saying it needs to be there, but it's kind of crucial because you're not a part of the contract. And people keep saying, well, we don't need the seller compensation addendum. Really? I think these 5 lines make a lot of difference to you as a buyer broker. That's why I'm coming back to this conversation once again. So let's see. Last is additional terms and conditions. You know, you got to be very careful with this. If there's something you want to write in there, please run it by me. Right now, I have not seen any additional terms and conditions. Have you guys seen any? So I haven't seen any. So I would, have you? You want to share? No. Okay, we'll leave that off. Yeah, let's not go there. Okay.
But for the most part, yeah, no.
Okay. Does the seller have to sign the seller compensation addendum if they countered it in the counteroffer?
Yes.
Do they sign a contract if it's countered? Yes.
Yes, that's right. Do they sign the contract if it's countered? Yes, they do sign the contract. They have a little box that says there's a counteroffer, and that moves everything to whatever's on the counteroffer overrides what is in the contract, right? So, you know, and again, keep that very clean. I do not recommend shifting from a percentage or writing in there a percentage and then calculating it out, because what happens if the purchase price changes, and that never happens, right?
Oh.
Never happens. We don't ever have a purchase
Never.
price change during the thing. Okay,
And then they put it on us, well, the contract says this amount, but this percentage, but it says this, yeah, we go round and round.
and then you go
Price
round
goes
and round.
down, the price goes down, they like the amount, but when the price goes up, they want the percent.
Yeah. When the price goes down, they want this the dollar amount previously agreed to. So please remember, you really need to do either percentage or a dollar amount, so that you don't get that confused. All right, I am going to go ahead and do a scenario here because there are so many elements of this that I want to break down for you as a as a buyer broker, honestly. However, in this scenario, Realty One Group represented the listing agent. And I talked about this briefly, but I want to talk about the different issues that occurred all the way through this. So the listing agent receives multiple offers on their listing. And yes, folks, that is possible right now. That is not a far-fetched idea. And yes, I know that it's a little bit odd to focus on that, but this is a real scenario and I want you to see why this is so critical. Okay. So offer B, there were multiple offers, like offer B was delivered. Line 37 did not indicate the seller compensation addendum was included. So no checkbox, right? Remember I told you how important that is, right? And no seller compensation addendum was attached to the offer. Offer B agent knew there were multiple offers. Okay, so you as a listing agent, what are you assuming at this point? What is your responsibility here? What are you reading? Somebody want to tell me here? They're not asking, why would they not ask for compensation? Because there are multiple offers. It is a strategic position that they may truly have taken, right? Certainly could be. And by the way, that is something you may want to think about is if you are a buyer broker, remember your buyer is responsible for your compensation. So if they want you to adjust your seller compensation on an offer where there are multiple offers, you just have to have the conversation. Well, understand that if I don't get it from the seller, then you're paying it. No, I want to make sure that that goes through that way because I want it better for the seller, right? That is a strategic move. It makes it more attractive in a multiple offer situation, right? So at no point during the escrow was an SCA delivered to the agent. Not that it would matter later on, but there was nothing delivered. Well, yeah, actually there was never delivered. What was the buyer broker compensation amount? Does anybody know? Doesn't really matter because the seller's not paying it,
No.
right? Listing agent doesn't know, doesn't matter,
Mm.
right? Okay, so let's talk about this. 3 days prior to closing, the buyer broker contacts the listing agent. Why? Oh, guess what? They reviewed the settlement statement and found out the buyer is paying the buyer broker compensation. Why did they find that out?
Because they didn't include an SCA or check the box.
Because they didn't include an SCA. So surprise, but the buyer broker is livid, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yep.
they screwed up.
Buyer agent threatens to cancel the contract per buyer's instructions. Now we know how that conversation went down, right? Because the buyer is shocked that they would be asked to pay the buyer broker compensation, right? Now, first of all, why would they be shocked to know that they're paying that?
No one spoke about this.
Lack of communication.
So that buyer broker didn't necessarily have a good communication with his client. And you know, yeah, the buyer would have signed a buyer broker agreement. And apparently it was not explained that if there was no seller compensation addendum, they in fact would owe that compensation. So part of the reason I'm bringing this up, really, this is for you to understand as a buyer broker, these are conversations you have to have with your buyer.
Melissa. but
Yes.
You didn't have this conversation with them. You didn't disclose that they needed a buy. So I'm thinking the compensation is gonna have to be eaten up at zero. Because if they didn't have the conversation.
No, it's already signed. They have a signed document. They
But,
have to pay. The buyer has to pay.
Well,
According to the BBPA.
but. if you
Unless-
didn't
well, the
go through
buyer
it-
signed the buyer broker agreement.
Right.
They just didn't understand that they could be held liable for this. And,
Says it right.
you know, and, but
They're the ones That they signed that.
there is no SCA, but what, would your buyer know what an SCA is?
No.
I explained it to them, yes.
But if with the purchase contract, but if the purchase contract was written and there was no SCA even discussed.
See, that's what I'm saying. So it wasn't just, they didn't see it.
Okay, so for those online not hearing this,
This is why I don't chime in.
no, it's good. It's good. She's like, this is why I don't chime in. No. So, but the agent's comment here is that the buyer didn't know that there was an SCA, so there shouldn't be any compensation owed, which is not true. The compensation's owed because the buyer signed the buyer broker agreement. Now, let's step this back because we can make the assumption that the conversation when that statement came out was between the buyer broker and the buyer telling the buyer that this is BS, right? The buyer broker is saying this is BS, the seller should be paying this. And let's go on here, right? Because the buyer does understand that they missed a document on our end. So the buyer does know that, but they're still shocked that they should be paying this compensation, right? Everything is being formatted that the list or the seller has done something wrong. Now, who did something wrong here?
Buyer's agent.
Buyer's agent.
The buyer's agent did something wrong. And by the way, I and my TC accept full responsibility for failing to deliver the document. These are actual written quotes
So you don't
From-
accept responsibility.
to-
First of all.
these are from text messages or emails directly from the buyer broker to the listing agent. So let me stop here and say something to you. Please, if you realize you've made a mistake,
Don't
Don't admit it.
write it.
In writing.
please contact me before you start writing things all over the place. But this agent went on actually and clipped their text messages between them and their buyer and sent that to the listing agent as well. Okay.
Hey, Molly, I said,
Let me help your case a little further.
I just say, I give it, don't pay me.
And someone in this room did say, well, apparently they don't know what accepting full responsibility means. That's correct, right? Because if you're accepting full responsibility for failing to deliver your own compensation agreement,
Done.
it's, to me, that's done. So probably not, probably the buyer is paying it, but let's
I'll be like, what?
so let's go on. So we're back to this 3 days prior. And by the way, this is a Sunday afternoon. Close of escrow is on Wednesday, right? This is, all these conversations are taking place on a Sunday.
Got a good buzz going on, watch it now.
Yeah.
They're calling me.
Well, and what is the listing agent's response to this?
Sorry.
Oh, well.
Like, well, this is all news to me. So again, what is the buyer broker compensation? Does anybody know? Does the listing agent
The
know?
amount or percentage? No.
Who knows? So we know.
Who knows? But there is a whole text conversation that says, this is what I'm owed. Like, really? From what?
Yeah.
Like, how?
Well, you
I don't even think.
Buyer.
I had to fill out an SCA. to check
Right.
that box.
Says I and my TC accept full responsibility. See, I was queued up to say this, but Ami got me earlier. Yeah, it doesn't really understand the responsibility for failing to deliver the document. Oh, so then he goes on and says, we have shown them 15 condos.
Yeah, but-
We've worked hard to get a full price offer for your team, right? Did our best to keep the transaction running smoothly, even kept them from asking for items on the Binzer, right? Well,
Good job.
okay, I guess. And then it says, wait, then it says, I asked for 3%. Can somebody tell me where he asked for 3%?
Yeah, he's not done.
Well, we don't even know.
Right, but then it says the lowest I have been instructed to take, this is obviously from his buyer, on the work we have done is 2.5%. Either way, the buyers will not be paying my commission. We can get it on the next condo. Okay? So I will let you guys make the decision and relay the news to the buyers. These are these are quotes. I'm not making any of this up, right? Maybe he was on a buzz from his Sunday thing and
NASCAR.
standing on NASCAR, right? But at any rate, these are all coming from the buyer broker directly to our agent who is forwarding them to me on Sunday afternoon. And yes, please call me on a Sunday afternoon if you get something like this. So let's ask the question.
Okay. It was like Sunday evening, I think it was like Sunday at 8 o'clock, hey, Melissa. I
Yeah.
have questions.
Yeah, that's
I
fine.
hate having to do that.
No, that's fine. So,
Too, it's not like I take joy in it, but I have to.
My
Okay,
shoe
there.
has a big-
so that's why help. So here's the resolution. So the question is,
Close, so
Yeah.
did the transaction, well, the buyer and buyer's agent threatened they are not closing this transaction. Now, for anybody that is a buyer's agent, if your buyer ever threatens 3 days prior to close that they are not going to close, that is an urgent call to me. I will tell you exactly what I'm going to tell you at that time is that your buyer must seek legal counsel immediately to understand their legal ramifications. So,
And their earnest money is in jeopardy.
earnest money is
Yes.
just a little piece of that. So we're gonna actually talk about this just a little bit. So let's talk about this. Yes, earnest money might be at play. Do you want to go into you want to say what else might be at play or what can happen?
They can be sued for specific performance.
They can be sued for specific performance because the buyer did not finish their deal. And we as agents cannot talk about the dollars involved in that. That's why they have to go see an attorney. But there is case precedence on this in Arizona. And to give you an idea, we had a different deal. We had a deal where we represented the buyer in this scenario. The buyer was purchasing a property from a seller. The seller was in a domino. They were closing on that and buying another property. The buyer had a contingency. They had closed their contingency. Once the contingency had closed, they had gone on vacation. It had all been worked out with timing. But very funny, during this vacation, the husband got a new job out of state. I don't know what vacation that was, but at any rate, the husband got a job. They come back and tell our agent, you know, my husband got a job. This is just a miracle. This is so amazing. So we're not going to buy the property. Don't worry. The seller can have our earnest money, and we'll even pay for their moving trucks. It's not a big deal.
But it doesn't stop there, because the seller made moves, the seller's doing
Yeah,
other stuff
they're
over here.
buying.
So the sellers made moves, correct? The sellers made moves. They're buying another property. They already have their moving trucks. The other seller is already ready to sell their home. This is a whole domino effect, chain link, right? So again, what did I say to our agent? Your buyer must seek legal counsel immediately, okay? This was a clear to close. Everything was ready to go at this point. The comment from the buyer was, I can't believe you guys are making me close this deal. It's a contract. We did not sign the contract. The buyers signed the contract, right? Because literally it would have been tens of thousands. And I'm not talking 10, I'm talking tens of thousands, potentially in the $50,000 to $60,000 range, that would have been potentially the cost that this buyer could have incurred. Does anybody know how many years the seller has to pursue this? 6 years.
Sure.
He's got that one down. 6 years. That buyer could be on the lam for 6 years waiting for that document to go. So think about this. If the buyer, so part of the things that tie into that is if the buyer doesn't purchase this, the seller is losing out on the property they're purchasing. They haven't sold their property. They put their home back on the market. It sells for $20,000 less. That is part of what the buyer is potentially liable for. All of the moving or unpacking or repacking or whatever those costs are, the buyer would be liable for. They try to buy another home because they lost the home they were under contract for. Let's say they were under contract on that home for $350 or $550, doesn't matter. They were on, and then they have to buy it for $600. That's another $50,000 that is now liable to the buyer. I'm only going over this so you understand this is a conversation well beyond our rules and regs and our area of expertise. A lot of ripples on that. That's why my comment to you immediately is that you must have your buyer go seek legal counsel. And it's not a, oh, I don't care, I'm not going to. If they're giving you pushback, then I need to be in that conversation. They've got to talk to legal counsel because we cannot advise them because the costs are huge. They can pray that the seller takes their earnest money. Because, and by the way, agent, don't ever stop a seller from taking earnest money when you represent the buyer, and there could be repercussions. Because if you are not fully explaining that if they take the earnest money or argue that earnest money back and leave the seller out without taking that earnest money, the seller has that 6 years to pursue that. So there better be a mutual agreement to get that earnest money back, which is always kind of fun from title, right? To get that earnest money back. So did the transaction close? Yes, it closed. If so, who paid the buyer broker compensation?
Buyer.
The buyer paid that compensation. Well, actually, I don't know, but I'm assuming the buyer did. I can tell you that the seller did not pay that. And I have to tell you though, I do often have to call other brokers. This was a very short phone call. It was a very brief phone call, and it was a very pleasant phone call with the other broker. I laid out exactly the information I had, that we had received a contract. There was no line 37 checked. There was no SCA delivered. And 3 days prior, the buyer broker is adamant that the seller is paying their compensation. The other broker just laughed. They said, "Oh, let me take care of this." And again, the buyer broker was contacting our listing agent, threatening to close. I sent another note to the broker. The broker said, "This deal will be closing." That was all. This deal will be closing. So please understand that, first of all, I don't ever want to receive that phone call.
You wanna be on that side.
I don't want to be on that side, but I can assure you I would have had the same response that that other broker had. The contract sets the precedence. You have to present your seller compensation addendum. So please, please, if you are a buyer broker, and there'll be another slide here, set your templates in either SkySlope forms or transaction desk. Set up your templates.
I was gonna say, Melissa, I accidentally unchecked SCA because I checked the HOA right above it. The agent, at least the agent was like, "Hey, did you need to put a check on that SCA?" And I was like, "I didn't." And I looked at it, as soon, and I shouldn't have been like stupid, and I did, no,
Right.
she was saying that. So when I clicked HOA, somehow I unclicked SCA, but the SCA was attached.
But the SCA was attached. That's the important thing, right? The SCA was there. Yes, the box needed to be checked. And if there's a counter offer, it needs to be in there, or you need to do an addendum to incorporate that, right? So, but at least you had one or the other. And again, yes, I used a scenario where there were multiple offers. But the point is, it's not the listing agent's job to call and ask why there isn't an SCA. Because
My client paying.
Yeah.
Why isn't my client?
yeah, why? Yeah, Art says, "Why isn't my client paying you?" Right? Come on. It's not your job as a listing agent. So buyer brokers, you need to make sure it's there. So again, what should you do to prevent this mistake as a buyer broker? Templates. Do your templates on SkySlope forms or transaction desk. If you do not have your templates created, please call me. I have several videos that show you how to do that. I will direct you to them. You can go onto the SkySlope forms training, transaction desk. You can go in and get videos with transaction desk, but you do need to make sure that those templates are set up. And what should you probably not do when you realize you make a mistake?
Don't accept it. I didn't.
Don't put it in writing and send it over to the other side.
Don't make their case strong.
Don't make their case stronger by sending them, well, first of all, don't threaten something.
Yeah.
If you make a mistake like that, please call me. And, my comment is going to be, can you call and see if there's anything that they are willing to do?
Sometimes
I
you
can tell you, arguing and telling them that the seller is out of line is not going to get you anywhere.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
So please understand that. All right.
Oh,
So,
the other
yeah.
thing, if they do cancel the contract and you say my advice to you is you need to seek legal advice immediately, and then you have to say, and there's nothing else that I can do for you from this point forward.
Correct. So the comment was, once they seek legal advice, you as the agent can't get involved with that advice. The attorney is going to advise their client. You have to stick to the contract and communication. Once the deal is closed, your agency is done. You cannot do anything. Now, I did reference a transaction coordinator in here. You probably missed it, but the own up was that I and my transaction coordinator made a mistake.
Yeah.
How many of you use TCs? So I don't know how many folks are online now, but folks online, if you are using TCs, there are a couple of things that are important here. Some TCs do prepare contracts. Again, templates, make sure your TC is using a template that those are already included in there. But are you reviewing the contract before it goes to your client? If the TC is writing it, are you reviewing it? It is on you, okay? So my guess on this is that the TC may have written it, it went out without him seeing it. That was my guess. I have no proof of that, doesn't really matter. But here's the thing. Does the TC need to be a Realty One Group agent? If you are using a TC and does a TC need to be a Realty One Group agent? True or false?
Oh,
True.
oh.
True.
Boy.
Realty, don't listen to title. They don't work for Realty One Group.
What do we know?
I said they don't work for Realty One Group. They're a separate entity. No, yes, in Realty One Group requires the TCs to be an agent with Realty One Group. They are a full agent. It is a Realty One Group rule. It is not other rules. But by the way, the other company we were dealing with was kind of surprised that the TC was not an agent in their office either, and they also have that requirement. So it's not just Realty One Group. So we did also let them know that they were working with 2 of their agents in their office. That TC probably had a really bad day after all of this. But so really, really important. Yes, they must be. Why is that? There are 2 reasons Realty One Group requires that. What is one reason everybody can think of?
Errors and emissions.
Thank you. Errors and omissions. If a TC is working for some other company with, with a different brokerage, whose errors and omissions insurance covers an error?
But how about them?
That's the problem. Who wrote the contract, right? Who's responsible? Now, most cases in at least for Realty One Group, it is typically the agent that takes the responsibility of it, not the TC, because the agent's name is on the file. But that lends to the problem. If you have a TC that isn't under our E&O coverage, how is that possible that our E&O coverage is going to cover that file, right?
Sense. Yeah. Sure.
Okay, and the other thing is, what does a TC have access to? What do they normally do if they aren't writing offers or contracts? What are they honestly doing? SkySlope. Is SkySlope open to anybody that wants to log in? No. Are you providing your username, or are you, right? Are you in the system and having access to Realty One Group's proprietary materials? That's why you have to be a part of Realty One Group. So if any of you online are working with a TC that is not with Realty One Group, please let me know. We have a whole list of TCs. Okay. You cannot work with somebody outside of Realty One Group. Now, is that across the board? Nope. There are plenty of companies that hire TCs that are not a part of their companies. That is their policy. That's fine. They're possibly small companies. They may not be. I don't know. Most of the larger ones that I am aware of do not allow TCs not to be a part of their company. So again, who writes your contracts? If you're a buyer broker, are you writing contracts, or is your TC writing the contract? Do you review them before going out to the buyer for signatures? Are you aware that both on Transaction Desk and I believe in SkySlope Forms, you can have there's something other than a CC. You can actually have a reviewer. In Transaction Desk, you can have a reviewer and AuthentiSign review it, and you have to open the file for it to move forward, okay? So please be aware of that. If not, they should be sending it to you before it goes out for signature. All right. So 3 things you can do to protect yourself. Set up in SkySlope Forms. Make sure you include that checkbox on line 37 on the SCA, that the SCA is included, and include the SCA as one of the prepared documents so that it's a part of your buyer purchase contract package. which includes your agency, your ABA, which may not get signed at that point, but it's still a part of all those, right? The SCA, no, that doesn't go there because this is stuff that's going on with your contract. So not the BBEA. And the purchase contract. HOA addendum is pulled down from the MLS. Lead-based paint should be pulled down from the MLS, but all those should be in there, so you make sure to include them. And for you as a buyer broker, explain how that buyer broker exclusive employment agreement works, right? Have a conversation about compensation as part of your offer preparation, right? Do you want me to ask for all of what is on my BBA? Or do you want me to adjust it to make this a stronger offer? That's up to the buyer, right? Should we reduce this? The buyer is still responsible for that compensation. I'm not telling you to reduce your compensation, but you need to have the conversation, right? So if somebody else writes your documents, proof them before they go out for signature. Now, I'm going to put title on here, the spot, because again, they have dealt with several of these issues. And I know you've had, I mean, Art obviously mentioned the situation where nothing lined up. And by the way, if that's ever the case and it's in my office, please call me. I will get that resolved. We should have caught that, but please let me know if it doesn't. I'm assuming they were not our offices because I would have thought you would have come up. But so some of your SCA challenges that you've had.
The one that sticks out in my mind was on line 10, the percentage and a dollar amount.
Oh,
It
both.
says or, but they put both.
Oh, yeah, don't do that, folks.
That's not good.
You can only put one in there. It must be a specific amount. You either have to do the calculation based on your offer and put that dollar amount, or you need to do a percentage, which could change prior to closing, right? Art, any other SCA dramas?
The issue with the BBA not being disclosed the title, the seller agreed to 2.5, the BBA was for 3%, we closed at 2.5%, and they even called there, well, that 3%. No one, if you don't tell me, I don't know, the CDI was set at 2.5%. I mean, it happens, I mean, so
the question is, who's preparing their CDIs that they didn't even catch it when they did their own CDI? That's funny.
I have one where the SCA was disclosed, the BBA was disclosed, and then they changed the amount between the two of them. And the broker said, well, can I just send you a CDI? I'd rather have an addendum stating this is that. That way there's no. I want as clear, not as clear as mud. I want as clear as clear. And as I told him, I said, because something happens, we have to go to court law. I want to be able to say, this is what they agreed to.
Okay, so you're saying that the SCA was changed in the.
The SCA was for 1%. The BBA was for another percentage. They agreed to the SCA amount, then they decided they were gonna change and go to a different amount. And they were gonna go back to the BBA amount, and they said, well, can we just do the BBA? And I said, no, because SCA is for a certain amount, which is basically what has been disclosed to us.
Okay,
But now that you disclose the BBA is 3% and the other 2.5%. Until I have something to clarify what the actual amount is,
okay, so the problem here is you have two different parties.
correct.
The BBA is with the buyer and the SCA is with the seller. There are two different things that modify those. So if you're modifying the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement and adjusting that, that is between the broker and the buyer. If you're modifying the SCA, that's between the buyer and the seller. So
Something in writing stating that, so clarification. And the other problem we have is that the SCA is for 2.5%, like you mentioned before. And the buyers has agreed to pay the other 0.5%, but you don't inform us.
yeah, and that is a problem. I don't know how many of you send your submit your CDIs
Normally don't
early.
submit the
That
BBA.
nobody submits it.
Or nobody
But
ever sends
that's
a BBA
frustrating.
unless the buyer agrees to pay that other 0.5% or what it is, then they'll submit it saying, hey, my buyer has agreed to pay 3%, the seller's only, according to the SCA, only paying 2.5%. he's gonna pay the other 0.5%.
So,
At that point, they'll provide the BPA.
so to both buyer brokers, buyer agents out there and TCs out there, I would definitely encourage you to have something in your file that encourages you to communicate with title early on. If the buyer broker and the SCA are not the same amount, and if the buyer broker is staying at that other amount, that it is communicated that there's a shift there, okay?
And they need they need that form.
The broker tenant, the
Yes.
buyer tenant employment agreement addendum is what changes the compensation, the BBEA. So,
We just follow instruction, but if we're not doing full instruction.
right.
We can only follow the instruction that we're given.
Title is saying they only follow instructions, and it is important for you to communicate with your escrow officer those variables, so everyone knows the differences between those scenarios. Let me stop sharing here. Any questions online? Let me see if I've got anything in the chat, because I can now see it. Doesn't look like anything's on the chat. If anybody wants to put anything there, you guys are being awfully quiet. You're welcome to add something there, or you're welcome to unmute if you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but if you guys have any other questions, we still have a few minutes, but let me go ahead and stop the recording.